There comes a moment in life when time begins to whisper louder than before, when every heartbeat feels like a question we've been avoiding. What happens when it all ends? In a rare and long-suppressed interview, Alan Watts spoke of death not as a tragedy, but as a return, a coming home to the very essence we've been seeking all our lives. His words were never meant to comfort in the usual way. They were meant to awaken, to dissolve the fear that has followed humanity for centuries. Because, as Watts revealed, what we call the afterlife is not somewhere else. It is the realization of what we have always been. He began by saying that our fear of death is rooted in a simple mistake. We've been taught to believe we are the body, that consciousness is something trapped inside a fragile form. But Watts laughed at that idea. He said, "You don't come into this world, you come out of it, like a wave from the sea. The ocean doesn't lose its water when a wave falls back. It continues endlessly. And so do we. The afterlife," he explained, "is not a place we go to. It's the recognition that we never left eternity in the first place." For the elderly, standing at the threshold of life's final chapter, this truth changes everything. Watts saw aging not as a decline, but as a sacred unveiling. He compared it to autumn, the most beautiful of all seasons, when everything returns its colors to the earth. To die, he said, is not to disappear, but to merge once again with the rhythm of the whole. The body fades, but what you are, the awareness watching all of this, remains untouched, timeless, infinite. He often spoke about how society hides from death, how it tries to make it sterile and distant. Yet, he insisted, death is not the opposite of life. It is part of the same song. To fear it is to misunderstand the melody. When the body falls silent, consciousness doesn't end, it expands. Watts believed that death is like waking from a long dream, realizing that you were never the dreamer, but the vastness in which the dream appeared. The fear dissolves the moment you understand that what dies was never truly you. So, imagine sitting across from him as he spoke, calm, smiling, his voice carrying the weight of eternity wrapped in warmth. The afterlife, he said, is not about survival. It's about realization. The realization that you were never born, and therefore, you can never truly die. These are the words that were never meant to be buried. They are not just for the dying. They are for the living, too. For all who wish to remember that what we call the end is, in truth, the most beautiful beginning. Alan Watts often began his reflections on death by dismantling the illusion that life and death are opposites. He said they're like the front and back of a coin, inseparable, defined only by one another. To fear death, he explained, is to misunderstand life itself. For Watts, life was not a possession, not something we have that could be taken away. It was an unfolding process, like the blooming of a flower or the rippling of a wave. You are not the one experiencing life from the outside. You are life expressing itself in a temporary form. The wave does not fear returning to the sea, because it understands that the ocean was never something apart. Death, then, is not a disappearance. It is a reunion. He believed that the tragedy of modern culture lies in its refusal to face death honestly. We hide it behind hospital curtains, soften it with euphemisms, and distract ourselves with endless noise. Yet, Watts argued, by denying death, we deny half of life's beauty. He often said that the flower's fragility is what makes it beautiful, not its permanence. If it bloomed forever, it would cease to be alive. The elderly, he said, stand closer to this truth than anyone else. They are not approaching an end, but a homecoming, the dissolving of boundaries between self and the infinite. Watts compared the experience of dying to falling into sleep. Not the frightened sleep of exhaustion, but the deep, effortless surrender that comes when one trusts the darkness. He explained that before we were born, we were in the same state we will return to after death. Pure, silent awareness, untouched by time or form. It's not like going into the unknown, he said, but rather into the known that we have simply forgotten. To him, death was not a curtain closing, but the moment the lights of the theater blend with the stars outside. He often questioned why people cling so tightly to the idea of an afterlife as a continuation of the ego, as though they will walk into eternity carrying their names, faces, and memories. Watts smiled at that illusion. You will not survive as you, he said, but you will not vanish either. You will return to what you have always been, the totality of the cosmos, aware of itself. He saw the desire for immortality not as hope, but as fear, the fear of letting go. True freedom, he insisted, comes only when you accept impermanence not as loss, but as liberation. And in that acceptance, something miraculous happens. The fear that once haunted you begins to dissolve, replaced by wonder. You begin to see that life and death are not enemies. They are partners in the same eternal dance. Every heartbeat is a reminder that existence moves through cycles. Inhale, exhale, creation, dissolution, birth, death. What's called this rhythm, the breath of the universe. And once you hear it, he said, you stop fighting it. You learn to breathe with it, to trust it. And in that trust, you find peace. Alan Watts believed that most of our suffering about death comes from our obsession with continuity. We want tomorrow to look like today, for time to march forward without surprise. But he explained that this craving for permanence is precisely what keeps us trapped in fear. He said, the more you try to hold on to life, the faster it slips through your fingers. To die peacefully, one must understand that life was never a possession. It was always a gift on loan from eternity. When you see this, death stops being an interruption. It becomes a graceful return of borrowed light. He often described consciousness as a vast ocean of awareness in which each individual life is a temporary whirlpool, beautiful, dynamic, but never separate. When the whirlpool disappears, the water doesn't die. It simply continues as the sea. In the same way, what we call I is the universe folding into itself for a brief moment, experiencing itself through a unique lens. When the lens breaks, the light does not end. It expands. Death, he said, is the widening of perception beyond the boundaries of form. Watts also loved to remind his listeners that the fear of death is learned. Children, he said, do not fear it naturally. They fear it only after adults teach them that it's something terrible. In truth, death is one of the most natural experiences of all. He called it the great forgetting, a necessary part of the cosmic rhythm. Just as day must give way to night, and sound must rest in silence, so must life return to the stillness from which it came. To resist, this is to resist existence itself. To accept it is to finally live without anxiety. He often spoke about the illusion of linear time, the idea that life moves from past to present to future like a line marching toward an end. Watts saw time as circular, eternal, and alive. Every ending contains the seed of beginning. Every death gives birth to life. You've done it all before, he said. You've died 1,000 times, and you will be born 1,000 more. And when you realize this, the fear vanishes. For him, death was not a doorway out of existence. It was a turning within it, a moment of transformation so total that we mistake it for loss. And perhaps his most comforting insight of all was that nothing real can ever be destroyed. The body changes, the mind fades, but what animates you, the awareness behind your thoughts, is not bound by time. Watts called it the eternal observer, the silent witness watching worlds rise and fall. When the body falls away, that witness remains, merging once again with the great whole. To die, he said, is not to vanish into nothing. It is to awaken from the dream of being someone. It is to remember that you were never a separate being, but the universe itself, temporarily pretending to be human. Alan Watts often said that the tragedy of modern life is not death itself, but our refusal to look at it directly. We treat death as an enemy, a mistake in the cosmic order, something to be defeated rather than embraced. Yet Watts viewed this fear as the ultimate misunderstanding. He believed that death is not the opposite of life, but its completion, just as silence completes music and stillness completes motion. Without death, he said, life would lose all depth. It is because everything ends that everything matters. The cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it falls. The moment we stop resisting this truth, the world begins to glow differently. Every breath, every touch, every smile becomes a miracle of impermanence. He would often compare the process of dying to the act of falling asleep. You don't know the exact moment it happens, he explained. One moment, you're thinking, feeling, drifting, the next, you're gone. And yet, in the morning, consciousness returns effortlessly, as if it had never truly left. What's believed death operates the same way. Consciousness does not disappear, it changes focus. It withdraws from one dream only to awaken in another, in a different form, a different expression of the same eternal self. You cannot die, he said, because you were never born in the way you imagine. In this view, the afterlife is not a place filled with clouds or angels or punishments. It is the realization that the universe never lost you. What continues after death is not your personality, but your essence, your awareness. Watts called it the clear light, the eternal witness that observes all beginnings and all endings without being touched by them. When the elderly fear death, he would remind them, what you truly are has already survived every ending you've ever experienced. Birth, childhood, youth, and age, all of these are small deaths, and yet the one who watches remains unchanged. He urged his listeners to imagine death not as darkness, but as a vast opening, like a door swinging into infinite space. Beyond that door, there is no fear, because there is no you left to be afraid. The self that feared the end was always an illusion, a temporary wave in the sea of consciousness. When it dissolves, there is only freedom. Watts described this moment as the return to wholeness, where all boundaries fade, and the separation between you and the world disappears completely. You do not go anywhere, he said. You simply stop pretending that you were ever apart. And this, perhaps, is the most profound gift of death. It frees us from the illusion of isolation. To die is to wake up from the dream of being separate, of being small, of being temporary. It is to remember that you were never an individual spark struggling in the dark, but the entire flame of existence burning brightly. Watts believed that once you understand this, you stop clinging to the idea of survival and start celebrating the mystery of transformation. The afterlife, then, is not about continuation. It is about realization. It is the great remembering of what you have always been. Alan Watts believed that our fear of death is, in truth, a fear of losing control. Society teaches us to plan, to achieve, to build lives that appear stable and predictable. But death laughs at those illusions. It reminds us that control is temporary, that life cannot be managed or owned. For Watts, this realization was not cause for despair, but for liberation. The moment you understand that you are never in control, you are finally free to live fully. You stop resisting the flow of life and begin to move with it. To let go, he said, is to be carried by the current instead of fighting it. Death is the final and most complete letting go, a surrender not into darkness, but into trust. He often pointed out that nature itself is the greatest teacher of this truth. Trees shed their leaves without grief. Rivers surrender to the ocean without fear. Every living thing yields when its time comes, and in that yielding, new life emerges. Humanity, however, tries to escape this pattern. We resist, we deny, we cling. But the universe is patient. It waits for us to remember. Watts said, you can't hold your breath forever. Sooner or later, you must exhale. Death, in his view, is that cosmic exhalation, the release of all that is temporary, so that what is eternal can breathe again. He believed that once we stop seeing death as annihilation, it becomes the most intimate experience of unity we will ever know. The boundaries that defined you dissolve, but what remains is not nothingness. It is everythingness. Watts compared it to a drop of water returning to the sea. For a brief moment, it had a name, a shape, an individuality. But once it merges, it doesn't vanish. It becomes the entire ocean. And when you understand that, he said, you will laugh at the idea of death, because it will be as ridiculous as fearing to fall back into love. To the elderly, especially those standing near the edge of life's final chapter, Watts offered immense compassion. He did not promise them an afterlife filled with familiar faces or golden gates. Instead, he offered something far more profound, peace. Peace in knowing that the end is not an end, but a return. He would say, you are not disappearing. You are coming home. The light that once entered this world through your eyes is not extinguished. It simply continues its journey, unburdened, unbound. And in that realization, the fear fades. You see that there is nothing to prepare for, nothing to fix, nothing to cling to. The moment you stop struggling against death, it loses its shadow. You begin to live not as someone racing toward an end, but as consciousness dancing through form. Life becomes lighter, simpler, infinitely more precious. The afterlife, Watts said, is not waiting beyond the horizon. It is right here, in every moment we dare to see beyond the illusion of separateness. Alan Watts often spoke of death as a teacher, not an ending. He said that death reveals what life truly is, because it strips away everything we thought we were. The possessions, the titles, the stories, all fade. What remains is pure awareness, free from all roles. He believed that death gives us the final and most honest lesson, that we were never the things we clung to. We were never merely the names we answered to or the bodies we inhabited. Beneath all that, we are the same consciousness flowing through every living being. And when that truth finally dawns, death no longer feels like an interruption. It feels like awakening. He would often challenge people to imagine what it was like before they were born. Where were you, he asked, before your first memory? The question, simple but profound, was meant to reveal that there was no before. The awareness that animates you has always been here. It simply took a form, borrowed a name, and entered the play of life for a while. When death comes, it is merely the curtain closing on that act. The audience, the stage, the music, all remain. The actor exits, but the play continues endlessly. Death, in this way, is not the vanishing of the self, but the quiet bow at the end of a magnificent performance. Watts believed that those who truly understand death begin to live differently. They stop chasing immortality and start savoring impermanence. They no longer postpone joy, love, or connection. Instead, they live as if every breath were both the first and the last, fully present, fully awake. Death, for Watts, was not something to avoid but something to integrate. To die before you die, he said, is to discover that death does not exist. When you understand that everything changes, and that change itself is the essence of life, the fear of loss transforms into gratitude for having ever experienced anything at all. He explained that when you resist death, you are actually resisting life itself. The two cannot be separated. The more you fight the inevitable, the heavier your existence becomes. But when you surrender, when you let go of the illusion of control, there is lightness, there is peace. Watts compared it to floating in water. The more you struggle, the more you sink. But if you relax, you rise. Death, he said, is the ultimate floating, the final act of trust. To die well is to trust existence completely, to fall backward into infinity, knowing it will hold you. And in that trust, something extraordinary happens. The fear of death dissolves into wonder. You begin to see life not as a linear story with a beginning and end, but as an eternal rhythm, waves rising and falling, galaxies expanding and contracting, consciousness awakening and resting. When you realize that you are part of that rhythm, not separate from it, you understand the essence of Watts's teaching. There is no afterlife because there is no after. There is only life, eternal, unbroken, forever rediscovering itself through endless forms. Alan Watts often said that the deepest truth about death cannot be understood by the mind. It must be felt by the heart. He described death as the moment when the illusion of I dissolves, and what remains is love. Not sentimental love, but the fundamental energy that moves through all existence. When the ego fades, what is left is pure unity, the recognition that you are never separate from anyone or anything. For Watts, this was not philosophy. It was reality. When you die, he said, you do not go anywhere. You simply wake up to the fact that you were never somewhere else. He believed that the fear of death comes from a culture that worships continuity and control, that cannot tolerate mystery. We cling to logic, to religion, to science, anything that promises certainty. But Watts taught that real peace comes not from answers, but from surrendering to the unknown. He would say, "To trust the unknown is to trust life itself. Death is not an event to survive, but a mystery to embrace." The elderly, he said, stand at the threshold of this mystery, not as victims, but as travelers returning home after a long and beautiful journey. He often used the metaphor of music to explain this. Life, he said, is not a march toward an ending. It's a dance. We don't listen to a song to hear its final note. We listen to be carried by its melody. Death is simply the last note that completes the song. And yet, when the song ends, the silence that follows isn't emptiness, it's fulfillment. The silence was always there, holding every note, every sound. That silence, Watts said, is eternity. It's what you return to when the song of your body fades. Watts also pointed out that when people fear death, what they are truly afraid of is the loss of identity, the disappearance of me. But the self, he said, was never real to begin with. It was a mask worn by consciousness, a role in the grand play of existence. When the play ends, the mask falls, and the actor, the eternal awareness, remains untouched. To identify with the mask is to suffer. To recognize yourself as the actor is to be free. Death, then, is not the enemy of life. It is the closing of one story, so another can begin. And when you see death this way, it becomes not a thief, but a gift. It is the great equalizer, reminding us that every moment counts, that every gesture matters. Watts said, "When you truly know that you will die, you stop being afraid to live." Death is what makes life sacred. It gives weight to love, meaning to compassion, urgency to existence. It is not the punishment of living beings, but the heartbeat of the cosmos itself. The afterlife, then, is not something to wait for. It is something we enter every time we awaken to the eternity pulsing within this moment. Alan Watts often said that when we no longer resist death, we stop merely existing and begin truly living. He believed that our greatest misunderstanding is imagining life as a line with 2 points, birth and death, when, in truth, it is a circle without beginning or end. The elderly, he said, stand closer to understanding this than anyone else, for they have seen the illusion of permanence dissolve before their eyes. Everything they once clung to, youth, possessions, ambitions, has slowly fallen away, revealing something quieter but infinitely more real. That quietness is not emptiness, it is awareness. The same awareness that was present when they were children, the same one that will remain long after their final breath. He often told his listeners that when you approach death consciously, it becomes not a tragedy, but a revelation. The world softens. The small concerns that once consumed you fade into irrelevance. The mind stops demanding meaning from life and begins to see meaning in everything. The light through the window, the sound of laughter, the warmth of another hand, each becomes sacred because you finally understand how fragile, how fleeting, and how divine it all is. Watts said, "To die before you die is to awaken." And this awakening can happen at any age, to anyone willing to see through the illusion of separateness. In this awakening, the boundaries between life and death blur. Watts described the afterlife not as a destination, but as a shift of perception, a realization that you never truly left the source. When the elderly fear death, it is not death itself they fear, but the idea of losing control, of stepping into the unknown. But Watts reminded them that they had already done it once, at birth. The baby did not plan to breathe, nor did it fear the world it entered. In the same way, he said, death is birth in reverse, the soul exhaling into infinity. You are not disappearing. You are returning to the rhythm that made you. He often used the metaphor of the wave in the ocean to describe this transition. The wave is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean expressing itself for a moment. When a wave falls back, the ocean does not mourn. It rejoices. In the same way, when a person dies, life does not lose them. It gathers them back. This is why, Watts said, every ending carries a strange beauty. The wave's fall is not failure. It is fulfillment. The same force that lifts us up into existence also welcomes us home. And this is where Watts's vision of death becomes something deeply comforting. He taught that the afterlife is not later. It is now, woven into every breath, every silence, every heartbeat. It is not waiting for you beyond the grave. It is the space within you that has never changed, the awareness that watches it all unfold. The moment you see that, the need to fear anything, death, loss, or time, vanishes. You realize that you have never truly been alive or dead. You have only ever been eternal. Alan Watts believed that the purpose of contemplating death was not to prepare for dying, but to learn how to live. He said that when you finally accept death, you stop trying to cling to life as a possession and start to experience it as a gift. Every day becomes luminous, every breath precious, every encounter sacred. You realize that the beauty of existence lies not in its duration, but in its depth. The people who understand death most deeply are not those who withdraw from life. They are the ones who live it with fearless joy, knowing that nothing real can ever be lost. He often said that the greatest misunderstanding about the afterlife is the belief that it begins after we die. For Watts, the afterlife is already happening. Each moment you let go of an attachment, each time you surrender to change, you are rehearsing the art of dying. Death, he said, is simply what happens when you stop resisting the flow. When you trust that flow completely, the fear of death disappears. Not because you know what happens next, but because you finally see that the next was never separate from the now. What's encouraged people, especially the elderly, to stop asking, "What will happen to me?" and instead ask, "Who is the one asking?" Because when you look closely, the me you are trying to protect cannot be found. It is a story told by memory, a pattern of thoughts passing through awareness. The real you, the silent witness behind every thought and heartbeat, was never born and can never die. To discover that is to glimpse immortality, not as something to hope for, but as something you already are. He described this realization as the moment the drop remembers it is the ocean. The fear of death exists only while the drop imagines itself separate. But when it remembers its source, it no longer fears merging. It rejoices in it. Watts would say that this merging is not disappearance, but expansion. You do not lose yourself. You become everything. The wind, the trees, the stars, all of it is you, continuing endlessly in new forms. Death, then, is not the end of awareness. It is awareness freeing itself from limitation. And so, as Watts concluded in his timeless wisdom, the question is not how to avoid death, but how to meet it awake. To see it not as an interruption, but as a homecoming. To understand that what you truly are was never touched by birth or time or decay. The afterlife, he said, is simply the recognition that life never ends. It only changes its mask. And when you see that clearly, you will realize the secret that Alan Watts spent his life revealing. You do not live in the universe. You are the universe, remembering itself once more. And now, as the echoes of Alan Watts's words linger in your mind, something deeper begins to take shape, a quiet recognition that death was never the end we feared it to be. Every insight he shared leads to this moment of understanding, that what we call the afterlife is not a distant place or a promise waiting to be fulfilled, but a truth already breathing within us. The awareness that watches, the presence that feels, the stillness behind every thought. That is eternity. Watts wanted us to realize that the fear of death fades when we understand that life itself has no boundaries, only transformations. He often said that those who truly awaken to this truth stop trying to hold on to life and begin to let it unfold naturally. There is no need to beg the universe for more time, because you finally see that you are time itself, endless, flowing, unbroken. Death is not the enemy of life, but its secret companion, reminding us to live with intensity, to love without hesitation, to see the sacred in the simplest things. Watts believed that once you see through the illusion of separation, you no longer fear losing yourself, because you realize you never could. This understanding turns death from a shadow into a teacher. It whispers that nothing real is ever lost, and nothing false can ever be kept. The people we love, the moments we've lived, the beauty we've witnessed, all of it continues, not as memory, but as the living pulse of existence itself. The afterlife, in Watts's vision, is not a destination reached after dying. It is the awakening that happens when we realize that we never truly left the infinite to begin with. To die, then, is not to end. It is to return. So as you reflect on his forbidden words, imagine death not as a door closing, but as a horizon widening beyond measure. What would happen if you stopped fearing the inevitable? How differently would you live if you knew that the universe itself was your home, and that everything, every breath, every goodbye, every heartbeat, is simply the cosmos remembering itself through you? What's believed that to live without fear of death is to live for the first time with complete freedom. If this message resonated with you, if it stirred something quiet and eternal within your heart, then allow that awareness to deepen. Let it stay with you, not as comfort, but as truth. And if you wish to keep exploring these timeless insights, join this space where reflection and awakening meet. Subscribe, share your thoughts below, and continue this journey with us. Because, as Alan Watts once said, you do not go out of life when you die. You go back to where you have always been, one with everything that ever was and everything that will ever be.